right, today out in the quarries, we found a lot of really interesting bones. In North Quarry, there's a very large sacrum coming out. If you haven't seen that, be sure to go by and see it. It's going to be a while because it's upside down, and the spines, which are about a foot long, are down into the ground below that. So it's probably about 2 feet that we'll have to dig around this specimen and then cast it to get it out, because you can't undercut it when all that's holding it up is a series of spines. So that's going to be really interesting to watch. So stop by North Quarry once in a while and check that out. Tonight in lecture we're going to be talking about the Thyreophora, which is a group of dinosaurs, some of which we have here on the ranch. Before we start, let's have prayer, so let's bow our heads. Gracious Father, we invite you to be with us here this evening and bless this lecture. Help us to understand more about these animals, these amazing animals that you made, and seek to understand what happened to them and why they're not here. We love you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Thyreophora, that's a funny name. Here is the systematic distribution of dinosaurs, and you can see that we have already covered the sauropodomorphs and the theropods of the Saurischia, and we're now beginning on the Ornithischia, and we're up here on the Thyreophora. Thyreos means shield, so these are shield bearers. Armored dinosaurs diagnosed by the presence of rows of dermal ossification. There are some of these that are called primitive, and why are they called primitive?
Because they were found first on the fossil.
Yeah, because they're found lower in the fossil record. They aren't necessarily what you would expect to be primitive, and no one's really suggesting that they had anything to do with the Thyreophorans that came afterwards. So they're classified as primitive because you have to have something primitive if you're going to have an evolutionary scenario. They aren't primitive in any sense that I can normally make sense out of. Yes?
What does ossification mean?
That is like in the notosaur scoot that Taylor found yesterday. It's a mass of bone of various sizes found inside the skin, within the skin. So crocodiles have dermal ossifications, and many of the dinosaurs have dermal ossifications as well. Yes?
So those are not attached to the bones?
No, they float in the skin. In a crocodile, that's what protects him from aggression from without. It is armoring in his case as well. So we have a couple of primitive forms that we'll talk about, so-called primitive forms, and then we'll talk about the Stegosauria and then Ankylosauridae, which is a subgroup of Stegosauria. So here we have a representation of the cladistics of the Thyreophorans, and we have Scutellosaurus down here and Scelidosaurus here. Those are both early found. They're in the Jurassic, but in the lower Jurassic. And notice, like the other so-called primitive dinosaurs, what are they doing? They're walking around on 2 legs. So since when is walking bipedally primitive? Good question. As you go on up the tree here, you see a division between the Stegosauridae and the Ankylosauridae over here that lead to the Ankylosaur, the Notosaurs in Gastonia, and the Ankylosaur. So Stegosaurus on one branch, Ankylosaurus on the other. Some of the armor plates are pretty impressive. There's a scale over here, so these are a few centimeters. These are the kinds of dermal ossifications that we find in the notosaurs here on the ranch. Stegosaurus is, of course, the best known of the Thyreophorans, and he is pretty well armored. Maybe not a whole lot up front, but he's got pretty good armory in the back. So let's talk about the so-called primitive Thyreophorans. The first fossil Thyreophorans found in the fossil record are small, 1 meter long, up to 2 meters, and they're bipedal. Where have you heard that story before? The earliest members are bipedal. Sauropods, theropods, and that's all we've talked about yet. So later on they became larger, they are quadrupedal with heavier armor. And so think about why it is that we find these bipedal forms low in the fossil record. Could that be because of something besides time and evolution? Best known of these small bipedal scutellosaurids is from early Jurassic in North America, so that's just after the Triassic. These are often found in, say, the Navajo period, when Navajo sandstone was being accumulated. 1 to 2 meters long. Now that's relatively small. If you had an animal that big in here right now, that'd be pretty scary if he was not domesticated. Scutellosaurus, yes?
Would these, hypothetically speaking, would these be able to be domesticated?
That's anybody's guess. That's like saying, what did they eat? We don't really know, but we can make guesses based on their dentition and various other things. So you can see that there are bony ossifications all down his back. Those rows of ossification might discourage some predators. I doubt they would discourage a tyrannosaur. Here you can see Scutellosaurus there. That's how big he is. And here is the arrangement of the scutes. Notice his name is Scutellosaurus, and his skin is full of scutes. That's what we call the dermal ossifications in these animals. That's what they're called in crocodiles. That's what they're called in other forms as well. A second so-called primitive form, also found in the lower Jurassic, this one in England, although there are hints that it might be in North America and China as well. It's larger than Scutellosaurus. It's up to 4 meters long. It had more body armor, and there are some suggestions that because of all this body armor, it might have had been an obligate quadruped. You can't deduce that from the form of the animal itself. The front legs are short, the rear legs are strong and long. It had a small head, and we're going to hear this over and over again as we go through the Thyreophorans. Small head, leaf-shaped teeth, which run to the snout. Massive limbs, nearly equal length, no armor on the skull, but its back was covered with lots of bony plates, and they had a broad sacrum. So we're beginning to get this broadening out of the sacrum that we're going to see in other forms as well. Here you can see a Scelidosaurus next to Scutellosaurus with a human representation. Here is the dermal ossification. Notice it goes not only across the back, but also along the spine as well, and even underneath the tail. So if you bite into one of these things, you're going to come away with a mouthful of bone. All right, so that takes care of the early forms, early in the fossil record, lower than the more, quote, more advanced forms, which are higher in the fossil record. The Stegosauria, we'll talk about this branch over here, Stegosauria. Stegosauria are the so-called plated lizards. They're medium sized, up to as big as this room. Probably they walked on all fours. How could you find that out? How could you determine that? Okay, the relative lengths of the front and rear legs, and the relative strength of the front and rear legs will determine whether they were obligate quadrupeds or not. They were herbivorous. How do we know that? By the form of the teeth. They didn't have meat shearing teeth, they didn't have grinding teeth, they didn't have bone crushing teeth. They had leaf-shaped teeth, which were probably basically best at stripping material off of leaves. They had small heads. All of these forms have small heads. Short, massive forelimbs, long columnar hind limbs, short, stout feet with hooves. Sounds like a cow. The unique feature of these forms were these vertical bony plates that are so well known that run along the spine in a single or double row from the neck clear on back to the tail. So Stegosauria is defined as all Thyreophoran ornithischians more similar to Stegosaurus than to Ankylosaurus. So we're distinguishing between the Stegosaurid branch and the Ankylosaurus branch. Here you can see the two branches. Here are the Stegosaurs, here are the Ankylosaurs. And so we're going to take a look here at Huayangosaurus, which is a Chinese form found in Middle Jurassic. So we've gone from lower to Middle Jurassic. This is for all the Stegosaurs. They're common in Middle Upper Jurassic. They become rare in Lower Cretaceous and last appear at the Upper Cretaceous boundary. Most of the scutes on the body get smaller than those in Scelidosaurus, but they develop those horny plates on their back. Huayangosaurus is the most primitive stegosaur. Why is he called primitive? Because he's the lowest one in the fossil record. Let's examine him to see if there's anything that you really would consider primitive. 4.3 meters, that's about 13, 14 feet long. Spike-shaped armor along the midline of the body and additional rows of small armor plates along each side of the row of spikes. Would you consider that to be primitive or advanced? If with all these accoutrements, would you say that's primitive or advanced if you didn't know where he was in the fossil record? Yeah, it sounds advanced to me. If it's primitive, then you have to answer the question, where did these primitive, so-called primitive features come from? Here's what he looks like. Pretty well armored. He has not only the ballistics at the end of his tail, but he has these amazing spikes on his back. He has the plates along his back, and then he has these monstrous shoulder plates that look like swords or scythes or something like that. This is almost unimaginable that an animal could look like that. This is kind of what we find of Huayangosaurus. Some of that material is deduced from various apertures on the bones and so on. Notice the small head and the persistent row of spines on the back. So now let's go on up here to Stegosauridae. Stegosauridae includes all Stegosaurus other than Huayangosaurus. They had low skulls. Distance between the eyes is greater than the depth of the skull. Distance between the eyes is greater than the depth of the skull. Long snout. The eye sockets were posterior. What effect would that have on vision? They could see what was off at the side, but in order to look ahead, what do they have to do? Turn their head. And as they turn their head from side to side, that's probably the way they walked, so it might have worked out very well. These are larger, they're massive. They have a pronounced rake on the body, meaning that the front legs were shorter than the rear legs, so their head was close to the ground. Some of those scutes that are smaller than Scelidosaurus scutes, some of those scutes became much larger and highly specialized. Flat-sided plates and spines and round in cross-section. So the plates are flat, the spines are round, ran in pairs down the back. So-called derived stegosaurs, that would be advanced stegosaurs, such as the late Jurassic North American Stegosaurus, had alternating plates rather than pairs. So they, instead of being like this, they're like this. So they're offset along the spine. We didn't know that for many years. We didn't know if they were alternate or opposite. And then someone found a specimen where the plates were still in place, and that's the way they were. Some of these forms had shoulder spines. These forms are described as being primitive. Why? Yeah, because like Huayangosaurus, they have the spine sticking out, so they must have been primitive, right? Then they had thagomizers. These are pairs of laterally spaced spines on the tail, and of course this is postulated to have been used in active defense. So here you have Kentrosaurus at the top, one of the Stegosaurids, and Tujangosaurus at the bottom. And notice those are mostly all spines rather than plates. And of course Stegosaurus itself. Again, this is the North American one. And you can see he had, in addition to these large plates on his back, and look at the size of these plates. There's 50 centimeters. That's over a meter long. Some of these plates were meter size, very large, bony plates that rode in the skin, not on top, not on attached to the bones. And notice he also has a thagomizer on the end of the tail. Thagomizer, what is that? Thagomizer is a distinctive arrangement of 4 to 10 spikes on the tail. These are believed to have been defensive measures against predators. You can imagine how they could have been used. This name, originally the spikes had no name. The term thagomizer was coined in 1982 by Gary Larson in his comic Far Side. Thereafter became gradually adapted as an informal term within scientific circles, research, and education. So here is the original cartoon. Now this end is called the thagomizer after the late Thag Simmons. So you get the point. These are formidable weapons on the end of a tail if that tail can be swung with any force at all. Here is an actual reconstructed thagomizer. Again, here's Stegosaurus, and you can see the thagomizer on his tail, not as strong as the one that's showed in that picture. Sometimes in Stegosaurus, they weren't too well developed. Stegosaurid had only a midline row of armor plates, very small head. Look at that head. And I challenge you to find a brain in there. It's just really small. And I remember hearing when I was in college that they had a second brain back in the spinal cord. It was a series of ganglia that were expanded back in the hip area, and it was thought that some of their activities were controlled from there. You can speculate as you wish about that. Tip of the snout formed a narrow, toothless beak. Well, what are they going to eat without teeth?
Plants?
Probably plants. They had cheek teeth that were leaf-shaped. No dental battery. A dental battery we'll learn about when we get to the Ornithischian dinosaurs. That's unique to them. But they didn't have these rows of replaceable teeth that are necessary to chew food. Long neck and tail, big shoulder blades. Possible semi-sprawling posture with front limbs off to the side. The forelimb had 5 short, broad toes with hoof-like tips. Hind limbs are very long and pillar-like, and they had 3 toes in the back. So they had 5 toes in the front, 3 toes in the back. Lots of small knob-like plates distributed over the skin and most of the body. Prominent plates along the backbone. 2 pairs of spikes on the tail. Here's that skull. And interestingly, that skull is all fused together. In our dinosaurs, many of you have found parts of Edmontosaurus skulls. That's because their skulls are not massive and fused like these are. Here's a museum specimen of Stegosaurus. Notice the short, stout front legs, the strong pillar-like rear legs, and the row of alternating plates along the back. Here's an actual specimen reconstructed in a museum. And here's a diagram showing those plates along the backbone. Notice underneath the neck, a very exposed area in these dinosaurs because they had long necks. Notice they had all these bony plates lining the whole front of the chest wall. Here's one of those plates, just to give you a close-up of what they look like. Notice they are vented. They have what looks like it could be circulation, like blood flow in there. Some people have suggested these plates were used for cooling. Some people have suggested they were used for mate display. Some people have suggested they're used to scare off the enemy. Nobody really knows. Here's another diagram showing the cross section. They're fairly thin, but very stout. All right, let's take a look at the Ankylosauridae. Any questions about Stegosaurs?
Do you find them around here?
Yeah, a lot of people think Stegosaurs are dinosaurs. They're one of the most popular dinosaurs, and one that a lot of people know about. And so that's a question people often wonder: are Stegosaurs here? They're found in the lower, the middle to upper Jurassic, and the lower Cretaceous. We're in the upper Cretaceous, so no, we don't have them here.
How big is the Cretaceous layer? Like how many hundred feet?
It varies from place to place. It can be thousands of feet or 10 feet or not there at all. Ankylosaurs. Ankylosaurs have been divided into 2 different groups, the Nodosauridae and the Ankylosauridae. And we aren't really quite sure about where this division originates. It's been described as paraphyletic by some people. Here's an example of a Nodosaurus, and down below an example of an Ankylosaurus, just so you can compare what we're talking about. Notice the heads are quite different from Stegosaurus. Ankylosaurids are called fused lizards. They have a rod of fused vertebrae in their backs. Now we have fused vertebrae. The duckbill dinosaur has fused vertebrae in their sacrum, usually about 9 vertebrae or so. But these had fused vertebrae in their backs, so their backs were not flexible. These are medium-sized, up to 9 meters. That's longer than this room. Yes?
Since the open acetabulum makes turning difficult already, we have a fused vertebrae that would further limit the ability for the dinosaurs to change.
Right, so they probably had to decide ahead of time where they were going to change direction. They wouldn't be able to make any sudden moves. But that's probably not in the vocabulary of a 27-foot long animal. They usually just go wherever they want to go. And so they probably didn't have to change directions very often. These are medium-sized quadrupeds. How many feet do they walk on? 4. And they ate plants. They were not carnivores, they're herbivorous. Here is an illustration showing you size relative to a human being, approximate size of a nodosaur. And here's an ankylosaur next to a human being. So the Ankylosauridae had small heads, but not small like the Stegosaurus. They had leaf-shaped teeth, non-interlocking teeth. That means that they couldn't bite the top teeth together with the bottom ones like we can to bite something off. They probably were used more like rakes. They had broadly arching ribs, very wide body. The body was covered with small round or square armor plates. Now, as I said, we found one in Gar Quarry yesterday, and they're typically about this big. We call them biscuits. They're about this big and about an inch thick solid bone. So these are massive kinds of armor. We have one site on the ranch where one of these is coming out. We have collected what was exposed at the surface. We dug out one of the, I think we dug out a humerus, but the rest of it's still there. Some of these animals had spikes or spines. Some had a tail club. The forelimbs were foreshortened. The hind limbs were longer. So they had a rake to them. Their range, Middle Jurassic to Upper Cretaceous. How many ankylosaurs make it into the Paleocene? As far as we know. 0. That's right. They are extinct at the end of the Cretaceous. Again, now looking at the Ankylosauridae, these are the true ankylosaurs. Low skulls, hooved toes, more heavily armored than Scelidosaurus, including scutes fused directly to the skull roof. So these bony plates that are in their skin are actually fused to the bone of the skull. They have rings of fused scutes on the neck and the front of the shoulders, fused scutes over the hip region, laterally facing spines in all but the most advanced forms. And one of the holes that we know about in the skulls of dinosaurs is not there. It's closed. They have small triangular hornlets sticking out the rear of the dorsal surface of the skull. So if you were to take on the skull of this animal, you might have trouble swallowing it because of these small horns on the back of the skull. Large shoulder spines in some forms, scutes down the arms, even over the eyelids and cheeks in some species. They probably were not active defenders, but they probably were passive, like an armadillo, that they would hunker down and absorb the attacks. The hips on ankylosaurs are very wide. The ilia actually flare out on top and form a shelf. Here's the skull. Notice that the opening at the top of the skull is gone. We just have the lateral temporal opening, and look how massive the skull is. It is, however, not so narrow as that of the Stegosaurus. Here's a representation of an ankylosaur. This is a nodosaur. Nodosaurs we do have here on the ranch. We don't have ankylosaurs. And again, notice the hips are very wide. Notice the bony plates, rows of bony plates down the back, and these massive spines on the front. These animals may not have had any other defense than just rolling up or hunkering down and absorbing the attack. But look at the armor on them. Here is a reconstruction of some nodosaurs. Hyalosaurus is an early Cretaceous European nodosaurid. Edmontonia is a late Cretaceous North American one. They have narrow skulls. They didn't have much armor or horns. They didn't have spines, and they lacked ossified tendons in the tail and lacked a tail club. So here you see just a cartoon of a nodosaur. I show this because it illustrates how big they are. Shorter, deeper, triangular skulls. Oh, sorry. This is out of place. The most sophisticated ankylosaurids were Ankylosaurini of the mid-Cretaceous of Asia and Upper Cretaceous in Western North America. They are in the Upper Cretaceous, we just don't happen to have them here. They had a bony tail club that would have been a formidable weapon. Here you can see a representation of their tail. Notice those vertebrae are designed to support that weight. And if that thing was swung, it could easily break a leg or do real damage to a Tyrannosaurus rex, if you please. Here's a reconstruction. Notice how barrel-shaped the body is. Short neck, barrel-shaped body. Now this is a Nodosaurus that was found in Canada a few weeks ago. It's the best preserved nodosaur anywhere. It has most of the armor plate in place, so we can actually see it and know that it wasn't just made up. What's that? You know, I haven't had time to look into that yet, whether it's in marine sediments or not, so I can't answer your question. Here's another view of it. It isn't all there. The rear quarters are gone, but the front part is really well preserved. So this specimen is going to tell us a lot. Here's one that's been reconstructed. Notice the bony plates. This is Nodosaur. These are all Nodosaurs. This is the one we have here on the ranch, Nodosaurus. And that's the Thyreophora.